Okay, welcome everyone to the Rhetoric Crash Course. This is part 2. I am going to go over part 1 very quickly. If you are listening to this video and the part 1 stuff sounds unfamiliar or confusing, or you just don't remember it, it's going to be a really good idea for you at this point to go back to the week that had the initial Rhetoric Crash Course and re-watch that video, because we are building on that knowledge. Again, I'm going to review it very briefly here, but it's really important that you understand all of that as well as the stuff that I'm going to add today. Okay, so remember, there are 3 goals of an argument: to change the audience's mood, mind, willingness to act. Remember that the hardest of all of those is willingness to act. It's very hard to get people to get up and actually do something, but changing their mood and changing their mind is easier. There's 3 kinds of rhetoric. Forensic rhetoric is that rhetoric of blame. It's courtroom rhetoric. Demonstrative rhetoric is tribal rhetoric. It's the rhetoric of praise and blame. It is the rhetoric of church. And then there's deliberative rhetoric, which is supposed to be the rhetoric of politics. This is your future tense rhetoric. With that, there's a claim of fact that mostly goes with your forensic rhetoric. Claims of value are demonstrative, and claims of policy are deliberative, because it's about what we should be doing in the future. All right, then there's ethos, which is argument by character. In the initial video, I went over decorum, virtue, practical wisdom, and disinterest. It's all ways that speakers or writers use to try to make themselves sound credible. Pathos is argument by emotion. This is where we're going to use emotional appeals. I want to make you laugh. I want to make you cry. Any of that. Pity, appeals to fear. All of those are your pathetic tools. Next, logos. We talked about the logical syllogism, the if and therefore statement. The logic needs to follow. So you have your major premise, your minor premise, and that all leads to your conclusion. Okay, and then we talked about KAIROS, which is seizing the moment, right? It's the right message at the right time with the right medium. When I introduced this before, I talked all about my dog and the problem with socks being left all over my house. And I talked about when was the rhetorical best moment to try to change this behavior. Okay, so that was the first set of information. So again, if none of that sounds familiar, you're going to need to go back and get the much more in-depth, involved presentation. All right, so now we're going to move on and talk about logical fallacies. Basically, there are 3 questions. So if you're reading an essay or listening to a presentation, there are 3 guiding questions that you want to keep in mind as you listen. Does the proof hold up? As you're listening, is it making sense? Does everything they're giving as their examples and their evidence, is it all holding up in your head? Are you nodding, going, yep, yep, yep? Or are you going, wait, what? Right? And so that's a really good test for that one. Am I given the right number of choices? Anytime someone tries to give you a categorical choice, that is a problem. Does the proof lead to the conclusion? That's what I just talked about with logos. You've got your major premise, your minor premise leading to your conclusion, which is your claim, therefore statement. So remember, in rhetoric, there are no rules. In philosophy, they don't want you to use any kind of fallacies. That's why they're called logical fallacies, because in logic, it's really important that all the time, every time, the premise leads to the conclusion. Now, in rhetoric, the rule is you can do anything you want. If you want to manipulate your reader by through pathos, they say go for it. If you want to reduce everything down to a ridiculous outcome, they say go for it. There are no rules in rhetoric. The only rule at any time is don't stop talking. Rhetoric, it's all about winning. You want to change their mood, mind, and willingness to act. And in a way, you just keep going till you do that. So I know if you've ever been in an argument, the most frustrating thing to happen is for the person that you're arguing with to put their hand up in your face and say, we're done. I'm not talking to you anymore. At that point, that's a rhetorical foul because, again, the rule in rhetoric is don't stop talking, right? You have to keep talking because if we keep talking, then I can keep trying to manipulate you so that I win. Mood, mind, willingness to act, or whatever my goal is. So there aren't any rules. Now, know that if I start using logical fallacies and you catch me, then that is going to hurt my credibility. And then all of a sudden my character suffers and I'm going to probably lose. So even though there are no rules and you can commit any fallacies you want in rhetoric, you do have to be really careful about what you're doing because you don't want to get caught, or you want to save yourself if you sense you're getting caught. Now, the point of learning all of this is that if you can't spot them, if you don't know all the different kinds of fallacies, then you might use them unknowingly, and that also can hurt your character because then you may not use it the best way that you can. It might not be fully manipulative. So it's really important to know what you're doing and plan your fallacies out in advance. I would also say it's really important to know the logical fallacies so that you can know when they're being used on you. Okay, so here we go, logical fallacies. Now, Jay Heinrichs in the chapter that you read, he kind of boiled it all down to 7 different fallacy types. So I've grouped them here in the same way just so that it matches the reading that you have. So the first grouping we have is the false comparison. This is when an author is going to use 2 or multiple things in some kind of comparison that doesn't work. So we're going to go through that list first. The first one is the all-natural fallacy. So you can see the definition there. An ingredient belongs to the same group as things that are good for you, so the ingredient is good for you. When I was thinking about this one, it made me think of the Serial podcast. Part of the reason that everyone couldn't think that Adnan would kill Hay is because, you know, he's this golden child. He's a football star. He's an EMT. He goes to the magnet program. So if all the kids in the magnet program are good kids with bright futures and college admissions, then there's no way Adnan could be anything but good. The all-natural fallacy. All right, next is the appeal to popularity. This is where your choice is legitimized because others have chosen it. This is also called the bandwagon fallacy. My favorite story for this one is the year that True Green Lawn Care came to my door. I was making dinner, they rang the doorbell, and my dog is barking, and dinner's burning, and I'm looking at this guy, and I'm going, oh, come on. But, you know, I'm nice, kind of. So I answer the door and he says, "Hello there, miss. We'd like you to sign up for True Green Lawn Care. We're going to make your lawn look spectacular this summer. Do you know the Hiders? They live next door to you. They signed up. Do you know the Mixes? They live down the street. They signed up. Do you know the Tollefsons? They live across from you. They signed up. Do you know the Joneses? They signed up too. Do you know all the people on this list? All of them signed up. Don't you want your lawn to look just like all your neighbors?" So, of course, there at that moment, I'm thinking, yeah, you're trying to sell me this by making me want to keep up, you know, with my neighbors. And so I explained to him that this was a bandwagon appeal. And then I went back to my dinner and said, you know, of course, no, thank you. So that's the appeal to popularity. Everyone else is doing it, so you should too. All right. The next one is reductio ad absurdum. This is where you're reducing an argument down to absurdity. I was looking online for some fresh examples of some of this stuff, and I came across a Dilbert cartoon. And this is from a while ago, like I think it was in the mid-90s. And an example of this kind of argument was in the cartoon. So Dilbert and his coworker Wally are at work, and the boss comes in the room and he says, "All right, I'm going to rank all the engineers here from the best engineers to the worst, and then I'm going to get rid of the bottom 10%. Well, Wally is starting to panic in the cartoon because he's thinking, oh crap, I think I'm in the bottom 10%. So then he's trying to reject or make the boss reject his argument, right? And so he reduces this down to absurdity by saying, "But boss, your plan is flawed because there's always going to be a bottom 10%. So you're just going to keep firing until there's fewer than 10 engineers left. And then you'll have to fire body parts. And that's going to lead to torsos and glands running around and blood and bile everywhere. So as you see, he reduced the argument down to something absurd. So the results are the consequences of extending this line of argument. So then the boss's position should be rejected. I thought that was such a perfect example of this. Like he's really going to fire body parts and chop people up because he can't fire whole people, right? So of course, making that argument then while he was hoping that the boss would say, oh, you're right, this is a terrible idea, I won't do it. And so that is why that was trying to be persuasive. So there you go, reductio ad absurdum. All right, next is the fallacy of antecedent. If it never happened before, so it never will, or it happened once, so it will never happen again. This one I call the dog bite fallacy in my head because I use this all the time. When I walk my dog, she's this beautiful Samoyed. She is so sweet and friendly, and you know, she loves little kids, and little kids love her because she looks like this snow puffy cloud, and she's always smiling and sweet, and so she's always, you know, running up to kids, and then the parents are always like, oh, does your dog bite? And I'm always like, oh, she's never bitten, she won't bite, right? And so that's the fallacy of antecedent. How can I assume just because she's never bitten a child that she never will? Right? She's an animal. How do I know that? I don't, but it's pretty persuasive, and the parents always let their kids pet my dog. Now, I've been really lucky so far, but that is the fallacy of antecedent. Okay, next is the false analogy. It's where two things are being compared that are not comparable. I have two examples for this one. One, when I first moved to Minnesota, one of my first friends, she was very religious, and she called me one morning and she said, Jan, I'd like us to meet at the flagpole outside of the elementary school because I have a group of moms and their kids, and we're all going to meet outside by the flagpole, and we're going to say a prayer before school because, you know, saying a prayer before school is like eating cereal for breakfast. They both get the day off to a good start. And I said to her, Kelly, did you really just compare praying to Frosted Flakes? Because I don't think you can compare the two. Now, I don't think I actually said that to her because generally people don't like other people that point out fallacies, but you can see the idea. Don't compare two things that don't have any business being compared. Another example that I have for you is I had a student write a paper about, it was arguing that video games were good for the brain. And so this was the part of the paper during his counter argument where he was trying to acknowledge that too much of anything is bad, right? So that was his acknowledgement of the opposition. So he said that first, and then he said, you know, if humans drink too much water, they can die. Now, that is where he ended that part, but I want you to think about it. Was he really comparing playing too many video games with drinking too much water? What was I supposed to logically conclude? That if I play too many video games, I'm going to die? So you can see that that comparison does not work. And I caught him, and that impacted his ethos, and therefore his credibility was shot. Okay. Next is the unit fallacy, and this one for me is a little hard to talk about in terms of the kind of argument you'll be writing for this class because it's not really scientific argument, so therefore I don't think you're really going to be speaking in units. The one thing that I was thinking of when I thought of this one was in my Read 960 course that I'm teaching this semester, we're reading a book about archaeology, and it's called The Lost City of the Monkey God. And in that book, they use airborne LiDAR, which is basically just this really cool plane that shoots out all these lasers and can map out the ground. And they use it to discover this archaeological find in Honduras. And so when they first published the initial maps, one of the critics of the project immediately publishes this huge article about how much he hates the whole expedition. And he actually criticizes it because he said he's looking at the LiDAR maps and he's saying, oh, look, they just found something the equivalent of a city block. They didn't find anything, right? And so he's comparing the map and what he saw to a city block, when in reality he was reading the units wrong on the map and he didn't notice what the scale was, right? And so the scale was times 1,000 or something like that, and really they found the equivalent of an entire city. And so that was the point, is he committed a unit fallacy there. So there you go. That was the best example I could think of in like a rhetorical situation. Okay, next you have the pathetic fallacy. You can see the word there, anthropomorphism. I'm not sure if you know what that word means, so I'm going to translate that for you into a word you do know, which is personification. Anytime we assign human characteristics to something that is not human. So we do that to be manipulative, right? We do that so that we can make something that is not alive, we can make it hurt or make it cry or make it funny. And that is then attributing these human characteristics to it, and then that's manipulative. So that is like personification. So there's your pathetic fallacy. Okay, so the next fallacy type is the bad example. And the example you have, there's two, I think, here. The first one is misinterpreting the evidence, where the examples don't support the conclusion. And so I was thinking about that one because to me it sounds like a non sequitur, which is where you have the premise not lead to the conclusion. A non sequitur is Latin for it does not follow. And so here, I was thinking in a rhetorical situation, you might see maybe an argument about global warming, and they might talk about the ice caps and the violent weather patterns and things, the disappearing of the polar bears. They might use all of those examples to just say, oh, this is in global warming. And so then the examples they're citing doesn't actually lead to the conclusion at all. And you're left going, wait, what? By the end, which is a non sequitur, meaning it does not follow. Next is a hasty generalization. Another name for this is stereotyping. So it's reaching a vast conclusion with scant data. So for example, my dad used this on me once where he said, I think I was having trouble with my car. And one time in his life, he had like this Volkswagen, and he took it to a German mechanic near our house, and this guy did a great job on his car. So now he thinks that all Germans are good mechanics. So when I was having trouble with my car, he said to me, okay, Jan, well, if you find yourself a German mechanic, because they really know how to fix cars, right? Which would be a hasty generalization. He's making this huge, broad generalization that all Germans are good car mechanics based on his one experience. That's a hasty generalization, or like I said, another word for that is stereotyping. Next, you have ignorance as proof. There is a fallacy called that. It's called the fallacy of ignorance. What we can't prove doesn't exist. So to say that, well, we can't prove the reason that the polar ice caps are melting and the polar bears are starving is because of global warming, so therefore it doesn't exist. There is an example. Or you could say, people use this for religion also, because they said, well, we can't prove that God is real, so therefore he doesn't exist. So there you go. That would be your fallacy of ignorance. Okay, the next type is circular reasoning. This is where you might, another name for this is obfuscation, which means you're just talking in circles and trying not to make sense. So the first example of that is literally what circular reasoning is called a tautology, where the premise and the conclusion repeat each other. Look at the example there. If it's in stock, we have it. That's a tautology. The conclusion and the premise are the same. You should stop smoking because you shouldn't smoke. Proof and conclusion are the same. That's a tautology. All right, the next one is all about choices and the number of choices that you have. So the first one is many questions. Another name for this is begging the question. The classic example of this one is, when did you stop beating your wife? Now you can see that my conclusion is based on an assumed truth. The assumed truth is that you beat your wife. And so therefore, when I ask you, when did you stop beating your wife? It's based on my assumption that you are, which is begging the question. Okay, a false dilemma is when you're forced into a categorical choice. This actually happened right after 9/11. George W. Bush was giving a really important political speech right after that happened. And his famous line from that speech said, "You're either with us or with the terrorists." That is a false dilemma. There you go. You could say that another name for that, you might have heard this before, it's called oversimplification. Reducing something to black and white, like there is no gray area. Okay, complex cause is when only one cause gets the blame for something that has many causes. So again, in global warming, if you were going to say, well, global warming can all be blamed on too many cars on the road, when really there's so many other things contributed to global warming. So that would be an example of complex cause. Okay, fallacy type 6, we're on to the distraction. So an ad hominem attack is where you probably see these in political ads. So, you know, during election season when all of a sudden all those political ads are on TV and all they do is attack each other. And so I've given you this syllogism on the screen here. You have person A says claim X, right? Person B is looking at claim X and going, well, I don't know what to say about that. So instead of actually dealing with claim X, I'm just going to call person B stupid. And therefore, what they said is wrong. And so that's an ad hominem attack. Name calling, anything like that. When you attack a person rather than the argument, that's an ad hominem attack. Okay, so next is a red herring. A red herring, the classic start of a red herring is, well, what we should really be talking about is, and change the argument's direction. So this is person A saying claim X, person B coming along and going, well, I don't know what to say about X, so I'm just going to like distract you with Y, because I can talk about Y. And then all of a sudden you're going to forget all about X, and therefore I'm going to win. So that's kind of how a red herring works. I don't know if you know this, but a red herring is actually a fish, and we all know that fish smell really bad. And so the idea of the red herring is that when they used to train dogs to hunt and to track in the woods, they would actually toss a red herring off the dog's path to see if the dog could kind of not pay attention to the smelly fish and still go after the fox. And so that's kind of where this idea of this fallacy came from. It's all about distraction. All right, the straw man. This one might be the most complicated of all the fallacies. The straw man, so I probably want you to close your eyes right now and build a straw man up in your head, and then have a really strong wind come by, and of course what happens to the straw man? He's gone, right? He blows away. And so that's the idea. So you have person A saying claim X, right? Person B goes, well, I don't know what to say about claim X, so I'm going to build this really silly argument that's kind of related and blow it down. And then people will think that claim X is wrong. That's in principle the idea of a straw man. So I actually, when I taught reading 1106, which is the college level critical thinking class, we read a book called Nickel and Dimed, and it's by Barbara Ehrenreich. And in that book, she basically is claiming that the minimum wage in the U.S. is way too low. Like you can't ever get ahead, right? And so she proves this by holding minimum wage jobs in 3 different states and failing miserably everywhere. And that leads to her conclusion. So that's person A saying claim X. Minimum wage in the U.S. is too low and you can't ever make enough money to get ahead, right? Okay, so then this guy named Adam Shepard then read her book in college and thought, Barbara Ehrenreich, I hate you, so I'm going to try to prove you wrong. So then he takes $25 and gets on a train, I think, and goes to Charleston, South Carolina, and starts out in a homeless shelter. And his goal was in 6 months to have a furnished apartment, a car, and $5,000 in a savings account. Oh, I'm sorry. That was his goal in a year. And he did it in 6 months. And so then he said, see, Barbara, you're wrong. The American dream is still alive. Now, that is a much easier argument to prove because, again, he started at a homeless shelter. He's also young and male and white. And he worked as a mover, which isn't even a minimum wage job. And when people have too much furniture, they give it to you. So how easy is it to get a furnished apartment, right? And so, and they get really big tips. So all of that was a much easier argument to prove than a mid-50s-year-old woman who was working as a maid, right? And she really did make minimum wage. And she refused to be homeless. So it's much easier when you have no overhead to start saving money. So you can see that they're different arguments. So Adam Shepard was trying to disprove Barbara Ehrenreich, but he made a much simpler argument for himself, and then see, Barbara, you're wrong. Blow down the straw man. So that's an example of a straw man. Okay. The last type of fallacy is we have the wrong ending. So for example, first you have the slippery slope. By the way, I love the cartoon here. Dude, don't do it. Somewhere down the road, it'll lead to chores. Love that, because that's the idea of a slippery slope. I always think of those Tom and Jerry cartoons where, it's like snowing and Tom pushes Jerry down the hill, and he's going down this snowy hill, and as he rolls down the hill, he's getting bigger and bigger and bigger because he's picking up snow and becoming this huge snowball. And when he hits the bottom of the hill, he hits all these people and they all fall down, right? And so that's the idea of a slippery slope. If we allow something to continue, it's going to predict the doom and gloom of the entire civilization. So, for example, one night I was sitting with my mother-in-law, and this is a good cautionary tale of don't talk politics with your in-laws. But the point is, we were watching like an old episode of Friends, and it was one of the episodes where Ross's ex-wife, I don't know if you remember this, but she was in a same-sex relationship, and so that was part of the episode. And this was a couple years ago, so it was during the whole the Marriage Act stuff that was happening politically that was going to legalize same-sex marriage. And so during that, because I think that was on my mother-in-law's mind, when she saw this part of Friends, she said, if we allow gay marriage to become legal, pretty soon I'll be able to marry my dog and the entire institution of marriage will be ruined. Well, that's a slippery slope argument, right? If we allow this one thing to happen, pretty soon the entire doom and gloom of society will ensue. There's your slippery slope. Okay. Then post hoc ergo propter hoc is after this, therefore because of this. So think about it for us a second. It's the idea that B followed A, so A caused B. For example, a couple years ago, my uncle came to visit me, and it was during that, oh gosh, it must have been 2009. Not that he hasn't been back since, but this is the one I remember. And he came, and he was a few days at my house, and my kids were little, and they were sick. I mean, they're always sick. Little kids are sick, right? And so then he was going from my house to my sister's house in Virginia. So he got on by the time he had left Seattle, come to see me and then come to see my sister, he'd been on 4 or 5 planes, right? And he'd been at my house. We had been out in the community, so at restaurants and things. He gets to my sister's house and he gets all sick. And so he says, Jan, because I went to your house, I'm sick. Right? And so that's post hoc. That's a post hoc fallacy. And it's funny because he's an education professor. So I was kind of like, Van, hello, this is a post hoc. But I didn't say that to him because he was really sick. And so I think the reason I remember it was during the swine flu thing is because he thought he had H1N1. So anyway, after this, therefore, because of this. Okay? That's a post hoc argument. All right, so we're done with fallacies. Woo! All right, hopefully those made sense. I would say if there's any one of them that you're still feeling kind of muddy on, I would recommend Googling it because there's tons of examples of these things online, and hopefully you can start to really understand them as you look at them online. Okay, so Cicero's outline is a way to be the most persuasive. It's like the way that classic oratory was always done. So in classic oratory are really good speeches. This was kind of the outline that these really good orators would use to tell the best speeches. So you read about this in Thank You for Arguing Too, where they took Obama's Democratic National Convention speech and they broke it down into this outline and told you that because he organized it this way, it was an amazing speech, right? And so we're going to look at all of the different arguments that we analyze, and then when we create our own argument, we're going to use Cicero's outline to help us be the most manipulative, the most persuasive that we can possibly be. So it moves from an introduction to a story. We know that stories are the most manipulative thing that you can do because our minds are wired for stories. We love stories. And so when Someone's telling you a story, you're engaged and you're with it and you're there with them. And they might be making you laugh. They might be making you cry, and that's all full of ethos, right? So narration is such a good way to start. Now, division is where they might present two sides. They might say, well, we're here to discuss this issue. So they're going to talk about the two sides, but they're going to do it in a way that divides the issue and helps you see that their side is better. So it's like, here, I'm going to split this up and I'm going to tell you why my side is the best one. Then they're going to provide proof. Proof is all about giving all the reasons, the examples, the logic, the facts, the examples, the studies, all that stuff, right? The refutation is the counter argument. And there's a couple parts to the counter argument. First, you have to acknowledge. Some people say blah, 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 right? And then you either refute or you concede, or you do both. So you could say, well, yeah, the other side has a point, and then refute with facts and examples and authorities and things like that. Or you can acknowledge the opposition and then just refute it. So just say why it's wrong. So be careful. You always want to make sure that there's an acknowledgement of what the other side is thinking first. So some people say, some might argue, the other side says, something like that usually introduces that refutation or counter argument, and then it's either conceded and or refuted. And then a conclusion with the thesis statement. So that's generally how Cicero's outline works. Okay, so there's an example of this. It is The Happy Secret to Better Work. It's by Shawn Achor. It is one of my favorite TED Talks like ever. So I am so excited for you to listen to this. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And this is a mentor text discussion board that you're going to be doing after you listen to the TED Talk. Now, because this is a video, the link doesn't work here. So you're going to have to go back into the subfolder on D2L and click on the link and watch the TED Talk and then do the discussion board. It's going to ask you kind of to apply everything you've learned here to the TED Talk that you heard. And the TED Talk's awesome, so enjoy that. All right. Now, I did talk a little bit during Cicero's outline about the refutation. So remember that another word for that, as you can see here, is the rebuttal. Counter-argument is another name you might see. But again, there's two steps. You acknowledge the other side, or you're going to see the author acknowledging the other side. And then they either concede, saying, yep, the other side has a point, and then they refute, or they'll just acknowledge, some say, and then they'll say, however, and move right into the refutation. Okay? So acknowledging the other side and either conceding and refuting or just refuting. All right, and that is the end of Rhetoric Part 2. We're done. Make sure you email me with any questions, because we're moving straight into applying all of this with our rhetorical analysis worksheet. You've already learned how to do page 1 and 2. You might remember the Everyone Deserves a Defense article and In Praise of the Guilty Project. We did those with the first 2 pages. We're going to loop back to Everyone Deserves a Defense to show you how to do 3 and 4. And then there's 2 essays about prosecutors. One I'll lead you through in a voice thread and have you practice, and then one will be due for an assignment. All right. I hope that this all made sense. Please let me know if you have any questions, and happy rhetoric.